My name is Elena Vance. I'm 30 years old. For a decade, my husband and parents called me the reliable one, the perfect porcelain doll who existed only to preserve the Vance family legacy and produce their next heir. They ignored my chronic pain, dictated my schedule, and treated my body like a piece of corporate real estate. But while I lay semi-conscious in an ICU bed, unable to speak as they plotted to override my life-saving surgery for the sake of their reputation, a man they couldn't buy stepped into the room. A surgeon they called the executioner of ego, handed me a pen and a choice that would dismantle their dynasty by sunrise. What my family didn't know was that I had been keeping a paper trail of my own, and the doctor was about to help me light the match. The Vances were the titans of the city's skyline, the kind of family that sat on hospital boards and had their portraits in gold leaf frames. My husband, Mark, and my mother, Lydia, ran the Vance Group with a cold, calculated efficiency that left no room for weakness. To them, my health was a PR hurdle, not a human crisis. I grew up in the golden cage, conditioned from childhood to prioritize the family's image over my own heartbeat. When the pain first started years ago, I was told to smile through it and not be dramatic. I was born to be a vessel for their future, a role I played with pathological compliance until the night I collapsed at our annual charity gala. As the letters on my own medical charts began to blur and my lungs struggled for air, my parents' first response wasn't a prayer for my recovery. It was a signature on a form that would have signed my life away to protect their pride. They thought they owned my future, but they forgot one thing. Every cage has a key, and mine was about to be delivered by the most feared man in the hospital. Growing up in the Vance household, I wasn't a daughter so much as I was a curated exhibit. My mother, Lydia, used to say that a Vance woman's greatest asset wasn't her intellect or her heart, but her composure. By the time I was 10, I had mastered the art of the Vance smile. A precise, effortless expression that signaled to the world that everything was exactly as it should be. Our home was a fortress of limestone and silence, where the carpets were too thick to allow for footsteps and the air always smelled of expensive lilies and polished mahogany. To the public, I was the crown jewel of the real estate dynasty. My life was a succession of high-stakes galas, ribbon cuttings, and strategic social engagements. Even my marriage to Mark was treated like a merger, a consolidation of two powerful lineages that looked impeccable on the cover of Town and Country. But behind the silk dresses and the 5-carat diamond on my left hand, I was crumbling. The pain began as a dull hum in my lower abdomen when I was 24. At first, I thought it was just the stress of the architectural firm, but soon it became a sharp, rhythmic stabbing that stole my breath during board meetings. When I finally worked up the courage to mention it to my mother, she didn't suggest a doctor. She looked at me with a cold, appraising eye and adjusted the collar of my coat. "Elena, don't be hysterical. A little discomfort is the price of a busy life. Take an aspirin and fix your lipstick. We're late for the opera." So, I became a professional at ignoring myself. I learned to breathe through the spasms while discussing blueprints for luxury high-rises. I learned to mask the cold sweats with expensive foundation and the tremors in my hands by gripping my wine glass just a little tighter. Mark was no better. To him, my body was a vessel for the next generation of Vances, a biological clock he checked with increasing frustration. Whenever I mentioned feeling unwell, he would remind me that stress is the enemy of conception, effectively turning my physical agony into a personal failure. I lived in a state of pathological compliance, convinced that if I just played my part well enough, the pain would eventually realize it wasn't invited and leave. I was a porcelain doll, beautiful and hollow, cracked on the inside but polished to a mirror shine on the outside. I told myself that the Vance name was worth the sacrifice, that my role was to be the steady, reliable pillar the family needed. I didn't realize that by ignoring the fire in my own body to keep their image pristine, I was giving them the fuel to burn me alive. The porcelain was about to shatter, and for the first time in 30 years, the Vance smile wouldn't be enough to hide the pieces. The annual Vance Winter Gala was always held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, a space draped in gold leaf and heavy with the scent of lilies, the kind of environment where perfection wasn't just expected, it was the baseline for entry. I was wearing a custom-fitted gown of emerald silk, the fabric so tight it acted like a second skin, or perhaps a corset designed to hold my failing body together. Mark stood beside me, his hand resting on the small of my back, not in a gesture of affection, but of ownership. Every few minutes, he would lean in and whisper the names of the donors I needed to charm, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and cold ambition. By 8 p.m., the dull hum in my abdomen had escalated into a white-hot roar. It felt as if someone had placed a heated iron against my spine and was slowly pressing down. I could feel the cold beads of sweat forming at my hairline, threatening to ruin the hours of work the makeup artists had put in. My vision began to fray at the edges, the glittering chandeliers turning into jagged streaks of light. "Elena, you're drifting," my mother hissed, appearing at my side like a specter of social grace. She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply noticed that my Vance smile had faltered by a fraction of a millimeter. "The board members of the Metropolitan Hospital are watching. Straighten your shoulders. You look as though you're about to faint." I think I need to sit down, Mother," I managed to whisper, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. "Not now," Mark interjected, his grip on my waist tightening. "We have the toast in 5 minutes. Just pull it together for the photos. You can rest when we get home." The betrayal of that moment was sharper than the physical pain. I was a structural engineer by trade. I knew what happened when a foundation was ignored for too long. I knew that things didn't just bend, they snapped. As the orchestra began a swelling waltz, I felt a sudden violent tear deep inside me. The room tilted. The sound of 1,000 polite conversations suddenly vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that drowned out the world. I reached out for the edge of a champagne table, but my fingers found only air. I remember the look on my mother's face, not one of terror for her daughter's life, but of pure, unadulterated embarrassment as her perfect porcelain doll finally shattered on the marble floor. My knees gave out, the emerald silk pooling around me like a dark stain. As I drifted into the blackness, the last thing I heard wasn't a call for help, but Mark's frustrated sigh. "Not tonight, Elena. You're making a scene." The weight of their expectations had finally crushed me, and as my heart rate plummeted, the golden cage began to dissolve into the clinical white of an impending nightmare. The transition from the ballroom's gold leaf to the ICU's fluorescent hum was a blur of sterile smells and the rhythmic, mocking hiss of a ventilator. I existed in the grey space of semi-consciousness. My eyes were heavy, glued shut by exhaustion, but my hearing was sharp, amplified by the terror of being trapped inside my own skin. I wasn't just a patient. I was a problem to be solved, and the architects of my life were already redrawing the blueprints. "The radical procedure is out of the question, Mark." My mother's voice cut through the medicinal haze, sharp and clinical. "If she undergoes a total hysterectomy at 30, the Vance-Sterling merger is effectively dead. No heir, no legacy. We might as well hand the estate to the state." "I agree," Mark replied, his voice devoid of the panic a husband should feel for a dying wife. It was the tone he used for contract negotiations. "I've already spoken to Dr. Holloway. He's been the family's surgeon for 20 years. He's willing to perform a conservative patch surgery instead. It won't fix the underlying necrosis, but it preserves the vital assets. It keeps our options open." A cold dread settled in my chest, heavier than the monitors taped to my skin. I knew what they were discussing. The radical procedure the ER doctors had mentioned was my only chance at a pain-free life, perhaps my only chance at a life at all. The patch was a death sentence draped in silk, a temporary fix that would leave me in agony but keep me fertile for the sake of a bloodline that didn't even value my breath. "Does she have to sign?" Mark asked. "She's in no state to sign anything," Lydia snapped. "Which is why we're invoking the Sterling Trust's medical proxy clause. It's a bit of legal gymnastics, but with Holloway's signature stating she's mentally incompetent due to shock, we can override her previous directives. It's for her own good, Mark. She doesn't understand the weight of the Vance name like we do." I tried to scream, to thrash, to tell them that I was right there, listening to them trade my survival for a future child that would only be another prisoner in their golden cage. But my muscles were leaden, and my throat was a desert. Then, I heard the crinkle of paper, the sound of a clipboard being settled onto a rolling table. "Holloway will be here in 10 minutes to finalize the override," Mark said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Once the board sees his recommendation, the hospital won't risk the liability of defying us. By morning, this will all be handled." They were going to do it. They were going to use a secret clause in a trust fund I'd never even read to rewrite my biology while I lay helpless. They thought they had found the perfect, silent doctor to facilitate their betrayal. They didn't realize that in this hospital, the Vance name didn't carry the same weight as the truth. The heavy double doors of the ICU didn't just open. They seemed to yield to a sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. The rhythmic clicking of expensive heels and the hushed, conspiratorial whispers of my family died instantly as a new set of footsteps approached. Measured, heavy, and echoing with an authority that didn't care about the Vance name. I don't recall authorizing a committee meeting in my surgical wing, a voice rang out. It was deep, textured like gravel and silk, and carried the chill of a winter morning. I felt the air in the room change. My mother, Lydia, ever the master of social redirection, didn't miss a beat. You must be the night lead. I am Lydia Vance, and this is Mark Sterling. We were just finalizing some paperwork with Dr. Halloway for my daughter's care. There's no need for alarm. I am Dr. Eris Thorne, Chief of Surgery, the voice replied, closer now. I could almost feel his presence at the foot of my bed. And since Dr. Halloway is a plastic surgeon with no privileges in this trauma unit, the only thing he'll be finalizing is his exit from this floor. Now see here, Mark blustered, his voice rising in that specific way wealthy men use when they are about to mention their lawyers. We are the primary donors for the new oncology wing. We've already discussed the conservative approach for Elena's procedure to ensure. To ensure what, Mr. Sterling? Dr. Thorne interrupted. I heard the sharp snap of a chart being closed. To ensure that you preserve a reproductive system that is currently necrotizing and poisoning this woman's blood? I've reviewed the imaging. This isn't a conservative approach. This is a gamble with a human life where the stakes are a funeral. I felt a hand, firm, warm, and professional, rest briefly on my arm. It was the first time in hours I felt treated like a person rather than a piece of property. The Vances expect a certain level of discretion, my mother said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy level. We have a medical proxy. We have the legal right to decide what is best for Elena's future. Your proxy is a legal artifact that doesn't hold up against a direct threat to life in this theater, Thorne countered, his tone flat and unyielding. Through the haze of my semi-consciousness, I imagined him standing there, the surgeon of steel I'd heard the nurses whisper about. He wasn't just looking at my charts. He was looking through their masks. I don't care about your wing or your donations. My patient is 30 years old, she is semi-lucid, and she has a right to survive the night. If you want to play God with her body, find a hospital that values your checkbook more than its Hippocratic oath. But in 45 minutes, I am taking her into surgery to save her life. If you try to interfere with that clipboard again, I'll have hospital security and the police escort you out for attempted medical fraud. For the first time in my life, the Vance family was met with a silence they couldn't fill. Dr. Thorne leaned over me, his voice dropping to a low, steady anchor in my sea of pain. Elena, if you can hear me, squeeze my hand. I'm going to get you out of this cage. With every ounce of strength I had left, I squeezed. And for the first time, I wasn't just a porcelain doll. I was a fighter. The silence following Dr. Thorne's ultimatum was brittle, the kind of silence that precedes a structural collapse. I could feel the heat of the tension radiating from the foot of my bed. My mother, Lydia, was not a woman who accepted defeat. She simply pivoted to a more deceptive strategy. Dr. Thorne, I admire your passion, she said, her voice reclaiming its melodic, Upper East Side composure. But passion is no substitute for legal reality. Mark, give him the document. I heard the rustle of stiff, high-grade parchment. The sound was distinct, not the flimsy copy paper of a hospital wing, but the heavy bond paper of a Vance family legal vault. This is a durable power of attorney, Mark stated, his voice regaining its smug edge. Signed and notarized. It gives Lydia and myself full medical and financial agency over Elena in the event of her incapacitation. The radical surgery you're proposing is a permanent alteration that goes against Elena's known wishes to maintain her family standing. We are opting for the conservative treatment under Dr. Halloway. It's all right there, in black and white. Through the haze, I felt a surge of cold fury. I knew that document. It was a paper I had signed years ago, shortly after my wedding, under the guise of estate planning and family security. They had been holding on to it like a weapon, waiting for a moment when I was too weak to protest. Dr. Thorne took the paper. The silence stretched for several agonizing seconds as he reviewed it. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't let the legal jargon intimidate him. This document is dated 5 years ago, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low hum. And while the notary stamp is authentic, the medical clause is specifically tied to the Vance Sterling Domestic Trust, a trust that, if I recall the morning's legal briefings correctly, was amended last quarter. That's irrelevant, Lydia snapped. It's entirely relevant, Thorne countered. Because as I look closer at the signature line for the secondary witness, I see the name of a paralegal who was disbarred for fraud last spring. Furthermore, you've attempted to use this to authorize an aesthetic preservation surgery in the face of a life-threatening septic event. In the eyes of the law, that's not exercising a proxy, it's a signature on a death warrant. He leaned over the bedside, his shadow falling across my face like a shield. Mr. Sterling, you are attempting to use a dated, legally questionable document to force a medical malpractice event. If you present this to the hospital board, I won't just challenge it. I will file a report for attempted reckless endangerment and document forgery. I am the chief of surgery, and my only proxy is the life of the woman lying on this table. You wouldn't dare, Mark hissed. Try me, Thorne replied. I heard the sharp zip of a pen across a clipboard, not theirs, but his. He was rewriting the narrative, and for the first time in 30 years, the Vance family's ink was running dry. The heavy ICU doors swung open with a violent gust of air as Dr. Thorne stepped out into the hallway, forcing my mother and Mark to retreat. They had tried to corner him near the nurses' station, thinking a more public setting would allow them to leverage the Vance reputation to shame him into submission. They were wrong. The hallway was lined with staff, residents, and even a few visitors, but Thorne didn't lower his voice. He amplified it. You've spent the last hour talking about wings, endowments, and legacies, Thorne began, his voice cutting through the clinical hum like a scalpel. He stood a full head taller than Mark, his white coat catching the harsh overhead lights. But let's be clear about what's actually happening here. You aren't trying to save a daughter, you're trying to preserve an incubator. Lydia's face went bone white. How dare you speak to us? I'm speaking to you as the chief of surgery who just watched you attempt to commit a slow-motion homicide for the sake of a bloodline, Thorne interrupted, his finger pointing toward the floor. This hospital bears your family name on the East Wing, Mrs. Vance. But that name is just gold-plated ego. It doesn't give you the right to dictate medical necessity, and it certainly doesn't give you the right to treat my patient like a piece of livestock. Mark stepped forward, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and panic. We'll have your license for this, Thorne. You're overstepping every ethical boundary. We are her family. Family. Thorne let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any humor. Family protects. Family listens. What you're doing is predatory. You're standing in a house of healing trying to negotiate a woman's survival down to a manageable risk, so you can maintain a social contract. You think your wealth makes you a VIP? In this hallway, VIP stands for nothing more than a person who thinks they can buy their way out of the consequences of their own cruelty. He turned to the head nurse, who was watching with wide eyes. Nurse Miller, call security. I want Mr. Sterling and Mrs. Vance escorted to the lobby. Their visitation rights are suspended effective immediately under the Patient Safety Act. If they set foot back on this floor before the patient is out of post-op and capable of granting consent herself, I want them trespassed. You can't do this, Mark shouted, his voice cracking as two burly security guards appeared at the end of the hall. I've already done it, Thorne said, turning his back on them with a finality that felt like a gavel striking wood. And if I see that forged power of attorney again, the next person you'll be talking to isn't a surgeon, it'll be the district attorney. Now, get them out of my sight. I have a life to save. As they were led away, their protests echoing and then fading behind the closing doors, a strange, heavy silence settled over the wing. For the first time in 30 years, the Vance name had been stripped of its power, leaving behind only the cold, hard truth of what they really were. The heavy, drug-induced fog finally began to lift, replaced not by the sharp stabs of the gala but by a dull, manageable ache. For the first time in years, the fire in my core had been extinguished. My eyes fluttered open to the soft, rhythmic hum of a recovery room. The clinical white walls didn't feel like a prison anymore. They felt like a clean slate. Elena. The voice was a familiar sandpaper rasp. I turned my head slowly to find Mark sitting in a chair by the bed. He looked disheveled, his designer suit rumpled, his tie loosened, but his eyes weren't filled with relief. They were narrowed with a calculating coldness. Somehow, despite Dr. Thorne's orders, he had found his way back in, likely by charming a night nurse or wielding the Vance name like a skeleton key. You're awake, he said, standing over me. He didn't reach for my hand. He reached for his phone. The board is demanding a statement. They know you went through with the radical procedure. Your mother is distraught. Do you have any idea what you've done to our standing? The merger is in freefall. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was filled with glass. I swallowed hard, finding my voice in the quiet strength Thorn had left behind. I survived, Mark. You survived at the cost of our future, he hissed, leaning closer, his shadow blotting out the sun from the window. You chose a life of architectural projects and a scarred body over the legacy we were building. But it's not too late to spin this. We tell the press it was a medical necessity you didn't fully understand. We keep the image intact. You play the recovering victim, and I'll handle the damage control. He looked at me as if I were a cracked structural beam that could still be patched with enough cement and silence. He waited for the pathological compliance to kick in. He waited for the Vance smile to return. But the woman who had collapsed at the gala was gone. The radical procedure wasn't a mistake, Mark. It was an awakening, I said, my voice gaining a steady, terrifying clarity. I looked him directly in the eye, seeing him for the first time not as my partner, but as a warden. I didn't choose the surgery to spite the Vances. I chose it because I finally realized that my life is worth more than a line in your portfolio. Elena, be reasonable. I'm done being reasonable for people who were willing to let me die for a press release, I interrupted. You wanted a vessel, Mark. You wanted a porcelain doll. But I'm a woman who finally knows how to breathe without your permission. I reached for the call button, my finger steady. I choose me. And since you aren't on my approved visitor list, you have exactly 10 seconds to leave before the security Dr. Thorne warned you about makes this very public, and very loud. Mark's face contorted in a mask of pure, ugly shock. For the first time, he saw the structural integrity of my resolve. He realized that the golden cage hadn't just been unlocked, I had torn it down. Without a word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing with the hollow sound of a man who had lost everything he thought he owned. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 30 years, I fell asleep in peace. While the monitors hummed a steady, reassuring rhythm and the hospital staff moved in the quiet efficiency of the night, I didn't spend my recovery in idle reflection. The fog of pathological compliance had been surgically removed along with the physical rot, leaving my mind sharper than it had been in years. I knew Mark. I knew that he wouldn't just walk away from the Vance-Sterling merger without trying to strip me of every asset I had left. But he had made a fatal mistake. He assumed I hadn't been paying attention during those 10 years of playing the reliable one. With a laptop Dr. Thorne's head nurse had helped me secure, I sent a single, encrypted message to a man named Silas Vane, a forensic investigator I had surreptitiously contacted months ago when I first felt the golden cage tightening. Silas didn't deal in gossip. He dealt in the digital ghosts of offshore accounts. He thinks he's been clever, Elena, Silas's voice crackled through my earpiece an hour later. The inheritance your grandmother left you, the Sterling Vance Liquid Trust, was moved 3 times in the last fiscal year. Mark used a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands called Porcelain Holdings. Quite poetic, really. I watched the cursor blink on my screen, the white light reflecting in my eyes. Can you trace the final destination? He moved it into a blind trust that only requires his signature to dissolve, Silas confirmed. But here's what he didn't count on. Because you were never officially declared incapacitated by a court, only by that fraudulent medical proxy Dr. Thorne shredded, the transfer of those funds 10 days ago was technically an unauthorized withdrawal. In the eyes of the law, it wasn't a strategic move. It was grand larceny. A cold, clinical satisfaction settled over me. While Mark was likely at some mahogany-paneled bar trying to spin our tragedy to the board, I was sitting in my hospital bed, collecting the receipts of his betrayal. I spent the next few hours cross-referencing my personal architectural patents with the family's recent development filings. I found exactly what I suspected. Mark had been siphoning my design royalties to fund the very merger that was designed to silence me. By 4 a.m., the audit was complete. I had a digital file containing every redirected dollar, every forged signature, and every hidden account. I wasn't just recovering my health. I was recovering my future. My husband had spent a decade trying to convince me I was too fragile to handle the family business. As I hit save on the final folder, I realized he was right about one thing. I was done with the family business. I was starting my own, and I was starting it with his stolen capital. The porcelain doll was gone, and in its place was the architect of his downfall. The morning of my discharge, the hospital room was flooded with a clean, uncompromising light. There was no fanfare, no frantic huddle of Vance lawyers, and no performative bouquet of lilies from my mother. For the first time in 30 years, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a blank blueprint. Dr. Thorne came in for one final check. His presence as steady as the day he had stood between me and a legacy of lies. He didn't look at me as a patient or a victim. He looked at me as a colleague who had survived a structural collapse. "The physical healing is done, Elena," he said, handing me the final discharge papers, the ones I had signed myself, with a hand that no longer trembled. "The rest is architecture. Build something worth living in." I walked out of the hospital lobby dressed in clothes I had ordered myself. Simple, comfortable, and chosen for no one's approval but my own. Waiting at the curb was no sleek, black limousine with a driver paid to keep my secrets. Instead, a yellow cab pulled up, its engine idling with a raw, unpretentious hum. As the driver helped me with my single bag, I saw a familiar silver sedan idling across the street. My mother was inside, her face a pale mask behind the tinted glass. I knew what she wanted, one last plea for the Vance smile, one last attempt to bring the porcelain doll back to the showroom before the board meeting. I didn't wave. I didn't look back. I simply stepped into the cab and gave the driver the address of the small, sunlight-drenched loft I had secured with the first recovered installment of my inheritance. As we pulled away from the curb, I felt the city rush past, the skyscrapers I had helped design, the streets I had walked as a ghost of myself. My husband was currently facing an emergency audit he couldn't survive, and my family was scrambling to explain a medical decision that had backfired into a PR nightmare. But for me, the weight was gone. The chronic pain that had defined my decade was a memory, replaced by the sharp, invigorating chill of autonomy. I wasn't heading to a cage or a merger. I was heading to a drafting table. I looked at my reflection in the window, not at the perfect porcelain doll, but at Elena Vance, a woman who had finally learned that the most important structure she would ever build was her own life. I was healed, I was solvent, and for the first time in my life, I was finally, irrevocably free.